Basically. So, first line. I primarily chose this photo just because they all do such stupid faces throughout the entire movie, and this guy is my favorite, and you can see why in the upcoming slides, because he does the most glorious faces. So just general rundown of the mummy. It's not fabulously accurate, but basically the main premise is that there is this pharaoh who has a mistress who he absolutely adores and no one else is allowed to touch. So of course his high priest sleeps with her. Naturally. So she kills herself, and then he is going to bring her back to life, but is interrupted partway through, and so she dies again, and the pharaoh punishes him by apparently putting a curse on him, so that if his sarcophagus is ever opened again, he will, bring the plague of the Bible, because they had the Bible at this time. To the modern world. So basically there are these, warrior folk who are there to protect the tomb and make sure nobody gets in, which of course they do, and then they awake the mummy, and then the mummy goes rah and starts eating people and coming back to life, and eventually looking like this rather than the weirdest skeleton I've ever seen.
Wait, is that the mummy?
This guy on the right is the mummy. This is the, good American who's trying to help people and stuff.
I need to find out what skin cream that guy's using.
I know, right? Anyway, they eventually, subdue him, and he sinks back into the giant ceremonial pool, which is super logical in tombs. So actually that's a good lead-in for the next point, which is basically, look at this beautiful body of water in the middle of a desert tomb. It's just, it's brilliant. They also have, in this movie, what have to be the sweetest, prettiest, best-tempered camels in all of the land. They never spit, they're not filthy, and they just sit there and look pretty for the entire movie. It's quite incredible. You've also got a whole bunch of white people wandering around in the desert for extended periods of time with no shade and apparently no water. No one gets sunburn or dehydration. I wish that was the case. That would make it much nicer. Next point. One bit that I was actually really impressed by, and just a note on this photo, I was trying to find a photo of this guy, and I found a good one under hot guys in period costume.
Just searching that photo.
Yeah, of course. There's quite a bit wrong with that, in that this is set in the 1920s. This is not at all the traditional guy that they would have worn in the first place, and he's meant to be from Nubia. So, yeah. Also, apparently the tattoos don't mean anything, which I was very disappointed by, but the Bedouin do occasionally have a tradition of tattoos, and he's meant to be kind of vaguely descended from the Bedouin. From what I could find out about them, they were actually a thing in ancient Egypt. They were a racial group that had originally come from Nubia, and that they were kind of hired as mercenaries, and they eventually became these really elite warriors and a police force, and it was just used to refer to the warriors themselves, as well as the cultural group. So yeah, they were like the paramilitary police force, and were in charge of guarding important areas like tombs and Thebes, which is where this is kind of vaguely meant to be set, in the made-up City of the Dead. Anyway. However, I appreciate that they put this in, but we do have no references to these guys after about 1000 BC. So the fact that they're here in the first, they're meant to be in the 1920s, still protecting, is quite incredible. They also ruin it even further when the guy announces at the end, "May Allah smile upon you." So you have a Muslim warrior group protecting Egyptian tombs because they're afraid of the mummy.
With the Jewish curse.
Yeah, with it. Yeah, it doesn't quite work. But I was actually quite pleased to find out that was actually a reference to a historical group. So that was a fabulous bit in the movie. So next, on to the actual movie itself. The pharaoh that they were meant to be talking about is Seti I. This is actually him. This is his mummy. That is how well preserved they tend to be. It's quite impressive. And I will go into the mummification process and how they do all that stuff in a bit. But he was again, with the continuity, he's the main pharaoh. The high priest who's meant to sleep with his mistress is from about 2400 BCE. This guy's from 1290.
That's a long and healthy life.
Yes, he lived and he looked very good at the end of it. I'm not sure how he did that. I agree, we should find out the skin cream.
Necromancy has its perks.
Basically. Seth the First himself wasn't super noticeable. He did have a couple of campaigns and he sort of expanded the empire a bit. But the main point that I thought was really interesting about him is he is actually the father of Ramesses II. And Ramesses II was the guy who had 92 sons and 60 daughters. And apparently only 8 wives. I could only find 8 actual wives. So I'm assuming he had a lot of
Bill Clinton only had one.
side business.
Bill Clinton only had one. Didn't stop him.
But yeah, also just emphasis on how different their culture was to us. He had 8 wives, 4 of whom were his own daughters. Yeah, so that happened. And it also kind of helps with the ruining of the movie, unfortunately, because he wouldn't, Seti the First wouldn't have had just a mistress that no one could touch. He would just make her another wife. Basically, they didn't have a problem with polygamy at all. So this guy's actually quite interesting in that he has the longest tomb in the Valley of the Kings. So he was actually buried in the Valley of the Kings, not in a pyramid, which again doesn't really help.
Was there a sort of competition culture of my tomb is bigger than yours, or?
Oh god, yes. The tombs were an indication of your wealth and how long, yes, well. And you know how long you'd reigned as pharaoh, because as soon as you become pharaoh, you start building your tomb. That's just how it goes.
It's like post-superannuation.
Yeah, basically. And I actually wanted to bring up, if we can, this site, because the Theban mapping project is actually quite incredible. They've gone through the entirety of the Valley of the Kings. Can we just go this one?
Oh, this is.
And actually mapped it all out, and it's really cool. Okay, so Egypt, Thebes, just outside of Thebes, we have this awesome Valley of the Kings, which is where a lot of the quite interesting and important pharaohs are, and where we have we get a lot of our evidence from Egypt. Unfortunately, there are a lot of the tombs were damaged because you get tomb raiders going in and trying to steal all the important gold, basically. They were going after everything that had any kind of value that they could sell, which is why you actually have the Magi, was to protect and stop these kind of thieves. But if we want to have a look, this is actually Seti First, and we can click on that. So he has a pretty damn long tomb. For just comparison, everyone was getting all excited about Tutankhamun. This is his tomb.
Oh yes.
That one. This is also where the sons of Ramesses II, Seti I's children were buried. So it gives you an indication of how many sons he had. But actually, I'd quite like to watch the video on this one, so if you could just go back to Seti First. Yeah, and start moving, because it actually goes through, it's lovely, and shows you some of the insides of the tomb itself.
This elaborately decorated tomb is appropriate for a pharaoh as important as Seti I. This is the first tomb to be completely decorated in all corridors and nearly all chambers, from the entry to the side chambers off the burial chamber. Some decorative themes appear here for the first time. There's a long and still partly unexplored corridor extending many meters into the bedrock beyond the burial chamber. The tomb was discovered in 1817 by Giovanni Belzoni, and news of the find generated as much excitement in Europe as the discovery of Tutankhamun's tomb did a century later. Attempts to copy reliefs on the wall and the wholesale removal of reliefs to museums in Europe did serious damage to the walls, and our only record, in some cases, is historical paintings that were made by early visitors.
That last statement is actually, unfortunately, really typical of archaeology from that time. They did the same thing in a lot of areas where they would just kind of rip relics out of the walls and transport them places. Really unfortunate thing with him is that he actually had this gorgeous white sarcophagus, which was like inlaid with lapis lazuli. It was apparently absolutely beautiful. And they took it to England, and the material it was made of was really highly hygroscopic, I think it's called, which meant that it absorbed water, and it's now brown and decaying, which is a little bit tragic, and is quite similar to what happened to a lot of the reliefs here, because as soon as you remove them from this kind of extreme, dry, hot environment, that's exactly what happens. They tend to decay, the colouring will fade, and it's really quite sad. And it's very similar to what's happened, particularly in Pompeii. It's a really good example. And the things that they've uncovered maybe 100 years ago have almost entirely faded just from the pollution and the smog and the light and just all the people coming through. So if we can go back to setting first on the slideshow.
I will attempt to do so. There we are. Now you buried over here.
Not setting first.
Setting first.
Okay, so one of the other quite interesting things about him was that they found his tomb in the Valley of the Kings, which I'm not sure if I actually said that. It's on the opposite bank of the Nile to what was then Thebes and what is now Luxor. So they found his tomb and not his body. Because one of the main things with Egyptian mythology and why they're so keen on mummification is that you've got to keep your body intact so that you can live in it in the afterlife. So one of the main ways of basically insulting the pharaoh would be to destroy his body because it destroys him in the afterlife. It's a really vicious thing to do. And it was actually believed that it was removed by first dynasty priests to try and prevent further desecration and looting. They've actually examined his body, and unfortunately, not with the movie, he died peacefully at the age of about 40. There was no indication of trauma. He had a couple of chronic illnesses, but he didn't die violently. So the place that his body was actually moved to is quite fascinating. It's called the Deir el-Bahari, and it's actually become this really extensive collection of mortuary tombs and temples. So particularly notable people who built here were Amenhotep I and Hatshepsut, who is quite famous for being one of the only that we know of female pharaoh, who started off looking quite feminine and ended up in her iconography looking a lot more masculine as times went on, as in they'd start painting her with beards and yeah. So there was that kind of transition that made her quite interesting to look at different periods of her reign. Okay, moving on to the actual mummy himself, was Amenhotep, who, as we said, was a good while earlier than that. He was the high priest of Ra, who is the sun god, but he was also the chancellor to Dejuro, who was the pharaoh at the time, and he was really interesting in that he was the first kind of known polymath. So he was the first earliest known architect and engineer and physician, actually, and he was the one who actually designed the Pyramid of Djoser, which is this one, which was the first stepped pyramid of its kind. You can see it's got those distinct different levels, and was probably the first actual construction of this kind of size, particularly of stone. The first kind of pyramids that were made were less pyramids and more a pile of stones to keep the jackals from eating bodies. So that's kind of where the idea of the pyramid started, and they eventually became mud brick, I think they're called mastaba, which did eventually become built out of stone, but he was the first dramatically large thing that actually looks like what we would consider a pyramid. Yes, Kate?
What's the actual scale of that?
I'm not sure, unfortunately. Big. I'm gonna go with...
In between an anthill and Giza.
Yes, let's go with that.
If I may put this out there, I've been to Egypt, and if that was the first one, I've seen that, and the first step is about 3.5 my height, and then each step would be like half my height less.
So it's very big.
Yes.
Yes.
Some keep pretty big jackals out.
But what was also interesting about Amenhotep is that he constructed and designed his own pyramid, his own tomb, and we've never found it. we've never actually found his tomb or his body. It's thought to be in Sekura, which is the burial ground for Memphis, which is quite the city that was closest to this and was one of the important religious cities at the time, which is quite close to where the stepped pyramid is also built. But I just thought that was quite interesting that he was cunning enough to actually keep it hidden from us all the time. Okay, on to the interesting bit of mummification. That just seemed too appropriate not to put in there. And I have to play this bit from the movie just because it is weird and gross and not at all representational of mummification.
Is it scary?
There it is.
So yeah, this is apparently the mummy. You saw how beautifully preserved Setting the First was.
That just looks like me, 7 a.m.
It does.
Basically. So while we're on this image in particular, a couple of things I want to point out. First of all, it wouldn't be nearly that easy to get into a sarcophagus. They're wrapped in a lot of linen, and then that is sealed in resin, and then they're put into the actual coffin or sarcophagus, with sarcophagus being made of stone, being the main distinction there. And then that is also sealed with resin, so it would be a lot harder to get into it than that is made to look. They also actually bind their jaws, so it doesn't do this weird poppy thing that's happening here. And I'm not sure where he's meant to have gotten this damage to the skull, having been simply wrapped up and put into the box.
Weren't there a bunch of live scarab beetles in that sarcophagus? Isn't that?
Yes, I will be getting to that.
Oh.
If we can
Those are some pretty longevous bugs.
If I recall, it was magic.
Cool. Okay, next slide. So we have mummification. Now mummification it can occur naturally, which is basically what happened in Egypt quite early on with just general burials before about 3,500 BCE, was that they'd be buried in quite shallow graves with the stones on top, and they would literally just dry out, basically, which would preserve quite a lot of the skin and the internal organs because there was no water to actually decay them. So unless they actually got eaten by something like jackals, they would stay preserved fairly well. And this actually started becoming, so this actually became a process where they would actually remove or simply treat the skin and organs of the body, basically to prevent further decay and keep them in the as if they were kept in the same conditions. So, as we were saying before, like when the sarcophagus was removed to England and was exposed to the dirt and the water, it proceeded to decay, and that's also what can happen with these mummies, unfortunately. So, in contact with religion, I explained it a little bit earlier, but it's actually, if they want to live for all eternity and be presented in front of Osiris, their soul can be reunited with the body and take pleasure in the afterlife. So that's a nice idea.
We have a question.
Pardon? Question?
Was the belief among Egyptians that in the afterlife the body would appear, for instance, as you did in the prime of life, and not like a desiccated corpse that could just be really happy?
I'm hoping it wasn't a desiccated corpse, because there was the concept of trying to keep everything sort of whole and together. So I'm hoping they weren't wandering around in giant bandages with no internal organs.
It's going to be difficult to have a good time if your liver's in a jar.
Yeah, exactly. That would be a little bit challenging.
Unless
And they
it's a jar of vodka.
And they didn't actually consider the brain as important, so that was discarded. Yes, that would have made things a little bit more difficult.
For people who could preserve a body for thousands of years, that doesn't seem like a very good understanding of physiology.
It wasn't.
They knew how to preserve.
To be
They
fair-
didn't know physiology.
To be fair, Americans with less teeth than brain cells can make beef jerky.
I actually found a thing which says that the heart was not removed and it was kept in the body because it was the seat of thought and feeling. So
Yeah.
the heart was important, the brain was not. So when we actually started getting onto this really specific process of mummification, it was about 2600 BCE. Sorry, just for context, BCE is before Common Era. And if I say CE, that's Common Era. So that's from 0, what we call AD onwards, basically. But everything in here is before Common Era. So the way that they actually mummified people through a process was they would eviscerate them, so they'd remove their organs, except for the heart, as we mentioned, and the body was actually washed with spices and palm wine, and then coated with minerals and oils. So the main thing that we know that they actually used was this substance called natron, which is a naturally occurring mix that was found. It's found in saline lake beds, and they actually found it in one of the wadis of Egypt, and use that consistently. A wadi is basically a valley that is made by really rapidly flooding water. So most of the time it's completely dry, but if you have major rainfall, then you get this massive water rushing down this valley and taking away a lot of material with it, and that's how you form the wadis. So this natron was actually a mix of what we call soda ash and baking soda. So it would basically just absorb all of the water from your body and actually keep it preserved. So the entire process of mummification took 70 days. It was, I think it was 40 days where you were actually being dried out, and then 30 days where you had the priests chanting around you, basically. So that was the religious section of it. There was a lot of other rituals involved with this, including like the opening of the mouth ceremony, where you were meant to like represent the body coming back to life. Didn't actually do it, unfortunately, but yeah. So the other thing, after they'd taken out your organs, they would save some of them, and these were put into canopic jars, which had a representation. Well, they later had a representation of the 4 protective sons of Horus on top. So there was a whole heap of different. There was a baboon, a human head on top of these jars that were made out of either pottery or stone, and had things like the liver preserved within them, and they would be kept with the body. And as I said before, the heart was considered this kind of seat of thought and feeling, so it was needed in the afterlife, which I'm glad to know. And I also thought it was really interesting, the brain being dragged out by a hook thing is actually apparently a myth from Herodotus, and they actually found a mummy which had a rod still in its head, which is a lovely thought. But it was actually just a plain rod made out of some kind of organic material, so they basically just mash up the brain and let it drain out. And they had archaeologists in the 1940s who tried this. I don't know what on. But apparently it was a lot more effective than trying to get it out with a hook, so cooey on the Egyptians.
They also lost their license.
No, that's called
1940s.
recreational archaeology.
Yeah, exactly.
If you can get a grant for it, you can do some fairly mad things.
Yeah, there's been things where they've recreated a lot of different things and like hacked at pig skeletons, and it's
Unfortunately,
weird.
archaeology intern Davis will have to produce his report posthumously.
So they were then, as I said, wrapped in linen with amulets within this linen, and also sometimes on top of it, to keep out the evil spirits. Then they were sealed in resin and put into the coffin, or sarcophagus, which was also sealed with resin. It was a lot harder to get them out than it was in that. You could also have multiple layers of sarcophagi. So I think it was Tutankhamun had about 7 that you had to get through, which I thought was quite impressive. They really did want to keep him safe.
So they invented the babushka doll.
Exactly.
Or pass the parcel.
Yeah, that's true.
So they want to keep him safe or keep him in there.
At the time, they mostly wanted to keep him safe. Shortly after his death, they tried to forget he ever happened.
Basically, yeah. Also, what I described just then was the fancy rich version of mummification. There were also a couple of other ones where they would just... The kind of middle class one was where they would put some kind of chemical, I didn't want to know what, into your body with a plug in your butt for about a month, and then uncork it and let everything drain out. So that was lovely. And then you had the drying out process. And then the poor class one was basically they gave you an enema with I don't know what,
Good.
but it got everything out, basically. So yeah, mummification, it's super fun. Next one. This is also where I need to... The reason I picked these two as the main symbols will be explained when we have a look at the movie, because the representation in that is very interesting. Sorry, so I should also point out that as well as the curse, he was apparently buried alive, mummified alive as punishment, which, as you can see, was entirely logical considering all of your internal organs were removed in the process. I'm not sure how they were going to mummify him alive. But
Well, I mean, he's already lived for 1,500 years. It's really not very difficult.
Yeah.
Because there was that point where he was trying to find all of the canopic jars, so presumably they
I
didn't.
think that might have been of his girlfriend. I think.
possibly.
He probably just wants to find his canopic jars because he needed his liver to have a good time in the afterlife.
Anyway, so here's him looking very panicked and not at all dead.
Many cake cuts in the budget.
That's my starting question. So how would that guy say?
Wait, what? Watching?
I'm not sure how that jar holds that many beetles.
It's magic.
Scarab beetles.
Is that singing for
No, that was
What was
the
that?
that was the,
Imhotep.
I will explain more about this, but that was Imhotep who slept with the pharaoh's mistress and was apparently punished most grievously for it. This was another which I just thought was kind of adorable.
That was not what I would have called adorable.
Okay, there is a little bit of an ick factor here, just warning. As there was with
Hey! Ugh.
This is the mummy. So yeah, they pull brilliant faces. I love the faces in this movie. But okay, so general context of most of that was that apparently scarabs were a punishment and they would eat you alive and things. That's not at all how scarabs worked. They were actually a really popular amulet at the time, and they were used to protect the mummy. So the scarabs were kind of centered. Sorry, this is a scarab beetle here. This is the one that's known as a heart scarab. There are a couple of different types that could be worn around the neck, and this one was placed on top of the chest of the mummy. Yes.
So when you say scarabs were used to protect the mummy, do you mean like amulets and things, or were
Yes.
live scarabs capable of eating like the
No.
tridents?
Not at all. They were used as protective amulets. So this was actually Tutankhamun's and was placed over his chest as a protective item. And just context for the use of the scarab is that Egyptian mythology is weird as all hell, and they have a lot of different myths. The sun myth is one of the particularly good ones. So there's a couple of theories that Ra turns into a giant eagle and flies the sun across the sky. There was also one where basically there's a god, and I cannot remember his name, but he turns into a scarab and rolls the sun across the sky.
Like a giant ball.
Like a giant ball of dung.
Isn't that still Ra? Isn't that still Ra?
No, it
it's
was a
not
different guy called,
Paul's Ra.
I can't remember his name, it started with K, I'll have a look for it, but no, it
Yeah.
wasn't Ra in that one. But basically, they would make up this mythology and then never let anything go. So you've got like 4 different stories of a whole lot of different things, a lot of which conflicts with each other. So yeah, that's fun. So scarabs were in themselves a symbol of kind of regeneration or rebirth because the sun would keep coming around, basically. And they were actually inscribed with spells from the Book of the Dead, again, to protect the mummy. And it was also interesting because there's this belief in a ceremony in Egypt. After you die, you get judged by a goddess, and I blanked on her name, but it's called the weighing of the heart ceremony. So you have to see, I think it was Matt.
I think
Her
it
name
was
was Matt.
Osiris, wasn't it?
No, Osiris is Lenore.
No, it was a female goddess.
Math is balance.
Yes.
Mars is the feather itself, but it's also a goddess because it's kind of both, and it's also a person. It's a very complicated thing. It is the feather and the goddess.
Basically, so your heart got weighed against Matt's feather of truth, And if you passed, you got to go on and live in the afterlife, and if you didn't, you got eaten by the crocodile-headed goddess. So that was fun. And basically the scarabs, the spells that were actually inscribed on the scarab were something about so that the heart could not give evidence against the deceased while it was being judged. I wasn't quite sure of the logic there, but yeah, so they were a protective element rather than an I'm going to eat you alive and stay alive for apparently 3,000 years, because there's another scene in this movie where the scarabs wake up and start eating people. It's a very, very logical movie. And then the bit with the cat, which I just thought was, that bit was kind of adorable. Best reaction to a cat ever. Was basically that they, in Egyptian life, they were actually really well respected and in some cases worshipped. So they were initially kind of useful because they were praised for killing, vermin and snakes. And they were they became a symbol of grace and poise and were sacred to the god Bast. So they were actually quite often mummified after death. And there was a Greek historian who described the punishment of killing a cat was death, even if it was accidental. So he writes about a case of a Roman warrior a Roman official who accidentally kills a cat and gets stampeded by this mob. So yeah, they definitely want the terrifying fly out the window in a cloud of dust reaction that was implied here. The other thing with Egyptian mythology is there are a lot of symbols, and a lot of them mean multiple things and meant different things at different points in time, and of course mean different things in combination with each other. So yeah, it really depends on what symbol you're looking at and in what time as to what it actually means. Okay, so off that, basically there is another scene in the movie which I really liked, which was this one, because she gets presented with a toolkit and it's kind of vaguely accurate, which I love. So you have your trowel and brushes, and honestly, probably wouldn't need the trowel in this case because you're not doing a heck of a lot of digging, and if you are, it's done mostly with like one of those giant machines that I can't remember the name of. Bobcat, basically. Yeah, pretty much. So I was actually quite pleased with that as a description of a kind of realistic set of tools, particularly for this kind of close work. And that's the thing with archaeology, is it really depends on what you're looking at finding and what you think you're going to find. I did a dig out at Lake George a while ago where we were basically trying to find stone artifacts. And she said, it's fine to be using a trowel and a shovel, and we would just dig straight down without particularly worrying about hitting anything, because if we hit bone, we would know it, pretty much, and there would be a lot of drama and have to call the police and all that kind of thing. We didn't find anything that dramatic, and we didn't find anything that would break when it came to using a trowel, which was fabulous because it made the work a lot easier. But in this kind of case, a trowel probably wouldn't be particularly useful, but in other cases, it is really good to have. There's also a couple of just amusing things on how they actually find this site, which is basically just people roaming around in the desert, and then hearsays about the city of the dead, which is filled with gold. It's always filled with gold. And then being led there by the locals. Not entirely how we find sites currently, though it does tend to be really interesting, particularly with quite a lot of Europe and England, in that you'll have farmers ploughing a field and come across something weird and go and report it, which is fabulous when it happens. But yeah, there's a couple of systematic ways you can actually go about finding sites, which is quite often it's things like ancient texts, and then you've got reports from locals if they're finding a high collection of coins or some kind of artifacts, indication that there was something big there. And the top right one is actually some of the current techniques we can use, which are it's aerial photography of areas, and you can also do things like picking up traces of metals, and actually in areas where there's really high canopy, actually basically scanning through the trees, you can get an outline of what's actually there.
They've been using that technique in Cambodia recently, and they
Yeah.
ran across a site that nobody knew existed because nobody had been there in ages because it's full of landmines.
That would keep people away.
Yeah, they basically say don't go into that area of the jungle, you will lose limbs, and apparently the plane went slightly outside of its original scan zone and just ran across this entire new site.
Oh, it's fabulous. And yeah,
Cool.
See, if the ancient Egyptians had landmines to keep out tomb raiders, far more successful.
The problem is the Tomb Raiders
They've
have
probably used
dynamite.
up by now. They can only go off once each.
But if you've got like 35 landmines, do you think people are going to be game
I
to go
think
in after the
over-
first 30
Yes,
have
yes,
died?
but I think the problem with that is the time period we're looking at. And the fact that you don't want to destroy the body that you're trying to protect.
That's why
I'm
you use
sorry
shaped
for the
charges.
So the other thing that it's actually quite well portrayed in this movie is sort of the attitude of archaeologists at that point in time. So it's set in the 1920s, and a lot of the archaeology up until that point and before that was basically wealthy Europeans looking for interesting things that they could take out and take back to their houses. So you get a lot of things like people ripping relics out of walls, and that happened a lot in Pompeii as well. And basically you've just got people trying to find big, interesting artifacts that they can take back and display. They're not interested in the kind of things that archaeologists are looking at, which is primarily trying to find patterns. So we're trying to find how they produced pots, what they were eating, how they would go about farming, what kind of animals and plants they had, and what kind of relationship they had with them. Which isn't really the kind of stuff that you can put up on a shelf. So it wasn't, a lot of these sites weren't investigated particularly carefully, and it was a lot of the bull at the gate approach, which unfortunately has compromised a lot of sites quite a lot, because as soon as you go in there and you've moved things, it's not in its original context and you can't actually take it as evidence in a case. It's become, it's been taken out of context and you can't actually use it. You can examine the object as an interesting thing in itself, but it can't add to this kind of patterns within space and within time. Because that's the other thing. As soon as you've moved something, particularly when it comes to digging, not so much with the Egyptian things, but if you're digging and you're looking at certain layers, there tend to be really clear indications of when things were actually buried. So you can kind of vaguely get a time period. Again, when we were looking at Lake George, what we were looking for was evidence of the production of stone tools. It was an area where there was a lot of stone tools produced, and the rocks were actually taken from a place that was a fair way away. So if you found any bit of quartz, it was quite likely that it was used in tool making. So we're looking for little tiny flecks of quartz that had been chipped off these actual stone tools. And one of the really interesting bits we found was a really big quartz bowl, but it was sitting on the side of the riverbed, and we couldn't use it. And it was one of the best examples that we found, and we couldn't use it because it wasn't within that initial context. So you couldn't associate it with the things around it and try and figure out why it was there and when it had come to be there, which was a little bit heartbreaking, but kind of understandable. One of the other things with, this is in Egypt in particular, with the Valley of the Kings, was, as I was saying before, there were tomb raiders. So most of these tombs had people go in there after they'd been sealed initially, whether it was the priests trying to do a nice thing and stop, the pharaoh being destroyed in the afterlife by moving his body, or tomb raiders just going in and trying to find amulets. A lot of it's being disturbed, which means it's been taken out of context, as I said, and it's a lot. It destroys a lot of the information, which is quite tragic. And that's why, in particular, everyone got really, really excited about Tutankhamun's tomb, because it still had the original seal on the door that the priests had put there when he'd been buried, so it hadn't been discovered because it was so tiny. One of the main good things about it being so tiny. So it hadn't been disturbed, and everything was in exactly the same location. And it was perfect and fabulous, because you had things like the original, kind of cart that they put in there for the pharaoh to use in the afterlife. And it was still there, and it was still intact, and this is amazing for organic material, because in archaeology, organic material is very, very rare. So we actually had exactly what a cart looked like. and how it was made, and we could see how it fit together, and probably how you can extrapolate and find out how it worked. So that was one of the reasons they were so excited about Tut's tomb. There's also one other point in this movie that just irks me, and it tends to happen as well as in kind of historical movies, in medical shows, where they can run tests in about 0.3 seconds. And they're magic and they just sort of appear and they have this precise date on them. Not at all how it works. It takes a long time, depending on what kind of technique you're using. We really don't have super accurate dating techniques, and if you're using anything like carbon or uranium dating, you will always get a range. It's inevitable, unfortunately. And one of the really interesting things with carbon dating is that the reason we keep getting, you'll quite often hear that we've redated something and we think that it was even older. The reason for that is that you're trying to date carbon that comes from the artifact that you're looking at. So it's carbon that was there originally, and it's really, really easy for it to get contaminated. So if you retest a sample and it comes out as being older, it's much more likely that that is the accurate one rather than the earlier version. Yeah, which is one of the other things, which was why we're so excited when we find things in original locations, because you can look at the soil around it and you can look at this thing and be like, oh, this is definitely carbon from this time period. And another example of that is slightly different, but with the DNA analysis of Ötzi the Iceman, who was found up in the, I think it was the Italian Alps, was that it suffered quite a lot of damage because it had been found by skiers initially, and then it was dug out by the police using a plow, basically. So they did a DNA analysis of him, and they punched through part of his skin, actually. They caused quite a bit of damage. It was very annoying. But they did a DNA analysis of him, and it came up as the policeman who found him. Which was super useful. Which actually leads quite nicely into my next point, which was information we can find from bodies. Another fantastic face by this guy. So this is actually a reconstruction of what they think Tutankhamun might have looked like from his actual skull. And you can see again, he's got the protective scarab with the wings extended, sitting across his pectoral. That was quite a common one. So we can actually get a lot of information from bodies, particularly if they're really well preserved, like mummies are. So even from just pure skeletal remains, you can pick up things like how tall they were. You can extrapolate kind of what's known as the living tissue, basically. So you can figure out approximately how tall they were, things, and I had a quick look. I'm not entirely sure about the appropriateness of these sums, because I got them off the internet. But I found out a thing that the average height of ancient Egyptians for males was about 159 centimeters, and for females was about 153, which seemed kind of reasonable. This guy, who plays Imhotep, is 188 centimeters. So he's a good this much too tall to be an Egyptian, which is unfortunate.
Does that vary much with social class?
Pardon?
Does that vary much with social class?
I don't know. I didn't look into it extensively. These were really rough estimates. I didn't want to question them too much because it's trying to span a really large region with quite scanty evidence in some cases, which is sad, but there would be a very strong pass bias in this case.
You've got to remember that Imhotep had actually had about 1,600 years to grow those.
Oh yeah.
An extra 30 centimeters isn't that much.
And on the other hand, it's probably quite difficult to find a bold, angry actor who's also
Short.
156 centimeters.
Maybe that's why he's angry.
I don't think he has quite the right build.
Vin Diesel is
He's pretty
short.
short.
He's really, really short. They
He's
put him
not
on boxes.
Quite that short.
Not quite that short.
Anyway,
Put him on
5'2".
Sorry?
I'm not sure he's quite 5'2". This. Basically, you're looking for someone shorter than me,
You're
guys.
looking for someone
Pretty
my
much.
height.
So they were fairly small, and Zach is quite right in pointing out that there would be a really strong class bias, because I'm assuming that what they were getting these figures off would have been a population of mummies. And as I said before, with the differences in mummification, the ones that were really well preserved and we'd probably get this information from would be the rich people, basically. And they would probably also have more access to food and lack and wouldn't have the nutritional issues that some of the lower class could potentially have had. That's another thing that happens in archaeology, which can be quite frustrating, is that there is a really, really strong class bias, because it tends to be that things from rich people survive a lot longer. So if you've got, 60 people living in an area, and you've got most of them living in wooden houses, and one guy living in stone, we're much more likely to find the stone than we are to find the wood. So even though it might have been only 4 people out of the 60, that's what we've got as evidence, and that's what we've got to work from, which is quite unfortunate, because it's so much more interesting when you can actually get a well-rounded picture, rather than just looking at how the rich people lived. So other really interesting things we can do with bodies is that you can actually create, if you've got enough from a certain area, you can create population profiles, which is what I'm assuming what they've tried to do with that height figure. So you can figure out kind of the age distribution, so if they had a lot of young people, how long people were living, what kind of health condition they were in at the time. And you can even, the point I put up here with occupation is actually really interesting, because looking at bones, if you've got someone, best example is if you've got an English archer who is using a 200-pound longbow, that impacts the skeleton. So you get a much thicker and well-defined muscle attachment sites, and you can actually tell that yes, they've used their right arm a lot more, and it's particularly around the shoulder, and you can actually determine groups of muscles that they were using in particular. So he would look very different from a farmer who was working very hard in the field, even though they would both have quite well-developed muscles. So you can actually do some kind of estimates as to occupation and how they were living at the time. Ancestry was another interesting one. There's a lot of things, a lot of bogus things about different parts of the brain corresponding to different personal attributes, which is complete hocus, basically. But you can actually, in some cases, tell vaguely the region that people have come from, and I'm saying that in a very, very general sense, as in you can tell if they were Caucasian from descending from Africa or basically from Asia. That's about as specific. You can get more specific than that, but it gets a lot less definite after that point in time, and yeah. So it also, of course, gets confounded because people will move and people interbreed, so you get combinations, and it would probably be really, really hard to tell the ancestry of, let's just go with Zach, because his family were from many different nationalities, so it would be really hard to actually pinpoint where he was descended from, because you've got this mixing of traits. That's also confounded by if you're trying to do sex estimates on skulls, which you can also do. So those two things in particular is ancestry and sex is primarily, skulls are one of the main things. Sex you can use, of course, things like the pelvis and long bones and that kind of thing, but the skull is the main area that you look at. And again, as with the dates, it's a range. You can have someone who's really typically female or someone who's very typically male, and then you get a whole spectrum in between, and it can be really hard to tell and put really definite ages on it. The way you actually tell age is quite interesting and really varies from person to person. So if you've got someone under about 12, then you can actually look at their dentition, and you can kind of estimate based on when teeth have come through and how well developed they are within the actual jaw itself, as to approximately how old they are. I mean, that can be confounded with a lot of things like nutrition, and some people have health issues which will impact it, but it's actually quite a good indication. Once you hit about your teenage years, until you get to about 20, 22, a lot of the ends of your bones are still growing and haven't yet fused, and we have quite well documented points of time when these things actually occur. So if you're looking at someone and let's say their wrist has not yet fused, then you can say, okay, well they have to be under this age because it's not fused. But let's say their femur has fused. Say, okay, well they're definitely above this age, so you could get a range from 16 to 20, which is really useful, and that tends to be about as specific as you can kind of get. Unfortunately, once we get above about 20, it gets even sillier with age ranges. I had one at one point that was, they were arranged from, it was 24 to 60, and that was the specific one. Yes?
Are we able to tell from somebody's sort of bone patterns, how old they are when they've been alive for more than 1,500 years?
Well, they probably, because of the trauma he had, he probably would have had a lot more bone fractures, and you can actually slice through the bone and count how many times it's been, well, you can count points at which it's definitely been repaired, so potentially.
Of course, in a manner of speaking, he was alive, so they probably could have just asked him.
And yeah, that would work.
Also, if you've got 3 giant claws in their arm, you figure they're probably Wolverine.
Oh,
Yeah, that's a really good indication.
Count the rings.
Totally how it works.
Actually, not as
not as silly as it sounds.
Yeah.
Not quite in the same process as trees, but when you have bone fracturing, you actually have the bone cells come through and remodel things, and that leaves an indication, which is a little ring. Quite often, this will fill up, and it does repair itself to a certain extent. The more of those rings you have, the more likely you are to be older.
Yeah,
Basically.
and you can also tell how long ago the fracture was before death by the size of it.
Or he could have just taken a really bad fall down the stairs and picked up like 60.
Well, yes, but if
they're
you
all
do
at the
that,
same time.
then it'll
That's
then
true.
it'll
Then
start,
it'll
and,
show
and
up.
it hasn't killed you. Then it'll start repairing itself.
Wouldn't that be an amazing find? What happened to this guy?
We've got a couple of bodies like that.
Change as you age, like the structure of your bone, the bonds inside it, they'll actually change as you age.
Yeah, that's actually partially indicative of what we were just saying with the different rings.
Mm-hmm.
So you get a whole heap more of these little rings, which do have little holes in them. It also happens that your bone remodeling processes get not quite as effective, so you get microfractures, which aren't repaired as well. So you do get a decrease in bone density and that kind of thing.
Because 24 to 60 is a very, very
Okay,
high error margin.
There's
Yes,
also
it is,
nutritional issues.
Yeah.
Yes, that figure I called out wasn't actually from looking at the osteons. That's what the little things are called.
Mm-hmm.
It was actually from looking at pubic symphyses. So it's where part of the pelvis fuses together,
Yep.
and that actually degrades with age.
Mhm.
So once you get past 25, you started degrading. I'm sorry. And so that's basically how we determine age. So younger, pre-pubescent, it's teeth. Puberty, it's bone fusion, and after puberty, it's decay. So, Claire?
Oh, I just wanted to make a point on what Mark said earlier about, the what happened to this guy thing. Our biological anthropology lecturer has a scale. You can say that a lesion is non-existent if you can't see anything. It's moderate if you kind of go, oh yeah, that's definitely there, and it's severe if you go, oh wow.
Oh shit.
That is the scale.
If you
That's
make it
official.
always kind of like, it's definitely a lesion. It's definitely
It's a
really
severe
bad
lesion.
And when
but
we're saying lesion can refer to a couple of different things. So it can refer to an actual kind of bump in the bone where the bone has repaired itself, or it can refer to an actual hole where the bone has basically freaked out because there's an infection or something and has started running away. So the main bone responses to infection are either grow and block it off or run away.
Which
I
is
don't really
why
want
we
my
can tell.
bones running away.
Anyway.
But in terms of bodies where you go, what on earth happened here? There was one body that got pulled out of a Minoan temple, which means it's about 3,000 years old or so, give or take a lot. A lot. What we eventually figured out had happened to him, he'd been stabbed quite badly, so he'd bled out, and half of the body had drained from him, and you can tell that because it leaves a different colour on the bones, but half of the blood was still in him. So he hadn't quite finished dying from that when someone set him on fire. And then the fire burned down the building, so a giant chunk of rock that weighed about 1.5 tons fell on him.
That's a bad
Did not like him.
And because when you get set on fire, you pull up into what is termed a pugilist pose, but it's basically the fetal position, but on your back. So when this chunk of rock fell on him, it crushed all the bones.
I would have called in sick to work.
So that was a body where we looked at this and went, what on earth happened here?
That's a severe lesion.
That is a non-existent lesion because he wouldn't have had time to actually repair anything. That is one of the cases where it would be a pain in the ass because you cannot tell if it happened before death or after death because he wouldn't have had time to heal from any of
If he
that.
had had time to heal from that,
It took
He
us.
might
would still be alive now.
He'd be Wolverine.
It took us 15 years to figure out whether this was a man or a woman. That's how severe the damage was.
And that is exactly the kind of body you don't want to be examining. You want to be examining pretty, potentially defleshed, tends to be really good physical evil analysis. We had our bioanth lecturer whinging because she was looking at mummies and they still had things on them, and she was very annoyed. She liked a clean skeleton.
I've
Sorry.
rarely used pretty and big flesh.
Noted.
You're from a different discipline.
This is
Okay.
very true. I had another point. Maybe forget it.
Sorry.
Also, one of the other things that we can do with mummies, which is not quite. I had one other point. Also, a brilliant face on his part. Is that you can, with these kind of mummies, occasionally get aDNA, which is ancient DNA, and you can do genomic sequences on them. So this was really interesting in the case of Tutankhamun, who was on the right, because they were trying to figure out his relationship to a pharaoh that was two before him, which was Akhenaten. Yes, who was a very interesting pharaoh in that he
Crazy.
He was a nutcase, and he reformed the religion, basically. And we know that he was definitely related to Tutankhamun, and we think it was potentially Tutankhamun's brother who then got the throne, and then maybe Tutankhamun, but they did DNA analysis, and it was terrifyingly confusing. It was like Akhenaten was his grandfather and his uncle, and it was very weird. Sorry,
There was a
point.
2010 study on that, which used mitochondrial DNA and said Akhenaten. It said firstly Akhenaten's wife for Tutankhamun was also his sister and his mother.
Yeah.
No, for Tutankhamun. Tutankhamun wasn't the son of Nefertiti.
No, Tutankhamun married Nefertiti.
Yes. But just for the direct line descent to Tutankhamun,
Yes.
his parents were full-blood siblings.
Yes.
And then the mitochondrial DNA also said that Akhenaten appeared to be Tutankhamun's brother as well as his parent, and they're closely enough related that you could basically call it also a grandfather, simply because they'd been that much interbreeding over time that it was essentially all of those relationships in one.
I thought the Lannisters
Egypt!
Oh, exactly.
Even
exactly.
Dalgety isn't that bad.
On that psycho note, does anyone have any questions or comments aside from just to admire his face? Fabulous faces. Yes.
What the hell is he looking at to make him pull the face like that?
Okay, basically, what has just happened before this scene is that this guy is apparently also the master of sand, so we can make like giant sand faces and things like that. And he has just pardon?
Do they have the same face? So
Yes.
They do. They
yes.
actually do. It's beautiful. So basically, the main hero guy is coming to rescue her because he's just kidnapped her because she looks like the mistress that he was trying to bring back to life. So he's just summoned a giant sandstorm against them because they're in this tiny plane. Fair enough. And so to distract him, she of course kisses him, which makes him forget about the sandstorm, and they land happily, and then he turns around and goes, she's grinning in the background. So that's basically
And that, ladies and gentlemen, is how you use your feminine wiles.
basically.
I don't want to know what sort of flights you've been on when you consider what actually happened to that plane landing happily. I think they're in pieces and half buried.
In pieces. They landed in. They
People
had.
landed happily.
No, one of them died.
One of the times that seemed to be implied that it wasn't like
2 out of 3
violent
survived.
death, like he had a heart attack or something.
Oh.
It was very well intact.
Plus,
They also very conveniently landed in quicksand.
Oh,
I loved anyway.
Plus,
Yes.
in fairness, as bad as it would be to have to kiss him just to distract him, at least by this time he's regrown his jaw.
No. When he kissed her in the first place, he had the full face, and then he started going back to mum.
Oh, God,
Kiss.
what?
Oh yes.
Oh,
It
damn.
got worse.
So that ruins your bed life.
Can I just call Rule 34 on that one?
Don't do it. Again.
I may. Can we go back to like the second slide? I found one more. I found slash fake a beast.
Oh, hell no!
I was on Google Images too long, clearly.
Okay.
Wait, you found images?
It was a drawing. It was a detailed drawing.
You find weird people on DeviantArt.
Okay, so are there more questions? Cool.
I just wanted to ask, the replica of the pharaoh's head seemed very androgynous. Is that maybe a trait, or...?
What do you mean by trait?
Like, I know in some families there's, like, with interbreeding, they lose certain features, or there's, like, certain diseases.
I think more
or
with
stuff
Egyptians,
that
their heads were actually compressed when they were young, when the skulls were still forming.
No, he wasn't. I read a summary of this. His head actually didn't have that. You're quite right. They do sometimes have head binding, so that it elongates the skull. He had that naturally. He had a slightly elongated skull naturally, which I thought was quite interesting. But it's probably that he was on that scale between extremely male and extremely female, and that's just what the facial reconstruction came out of.
Also, Akhenaten looked, his body figure in all of the statues, he's incredibly feminine.
Oh, he didn't start out incredibly feminine.
He rapidly became incredibly feminine.
He did the opposite to Hatshepsut. He got really, really feminine.
And the data now suggests that that wasn't purely stylization, that was a reflection of what his body actually looks like.
Because he had a particular disease, which... they're implying that he had a particular disease that potentially caused that.
Okay, so you've actually just answered the first question, which is why would they potentially portray him as particularly feminine?
Because he wanted... he was revolutionary in that he wanted to be displayed as he appeared, rather than as... Like, there's a scene of him playing with his children. That never happens normally in Egyptian mythology. It'll be like, look, I'm slaying people and hunting lions. I'm not playing with my kids. Anyway,
and the second question, the skull binding that went on to elongate the head, was that done in reference to the aliens that built the pyramid?
Yes, it was.
That's the
They saw them in
Indiana Jones.
Yes.
But you do find skull binding in other cultures. There's some suggestion that skull binding was done by certain indigenous groups in Australia and in various places in the Pacific.
You see,
having
watched Ancient Aliens, it's actually because the aliens were in all sorts of different cultures building.
But if we've reached Ancient Aliens, perhaps we should break for just a small amount of more
I just wanted to make one other point on there is some really interesting cases of body modification. So you do get skull binding, you get the Chinese foot binding, there's rib binding that if it occurs long enough, you can actually really tell what's happened because the ribs will actually disarticulate from the spine. You just have like floating ribs. It's quite disturbing. So yeah, there are a lot of cases of body modification and teeth filing and particularly pulling out certain teeth, ritual scarring, ritual tattoos, all that kind of thing.
Does that head binding have any negative effect on you?
Hurts like nothing else.
It's probably, the inbreeding's probably got more of a negative effect.
The human brain, when it's developing, can change shape quite easily, so there's no real evidence to state that somebody who had their head bound in a particular shape or was cradle boarded or stuff like that, you find skulls that are very flat on top because they've sort of been tied into the cradle.
Oh, you also find that if you apparently if you put a baby on the floor for too long, they'll get a flat skull. Because the sutures, the different parts of the skull fuse at different points in time. The latest one I could find in general was about 4 years.
This bit here.
Which is a soft spot. That's what is traditionally the soft spot. But you also get things that I didn't actually realise, but this bit here doesn't actually fuse until about 12 months, and your jaw doesn't fuse together until about 2 years.
So other forms, of course, of body modification could leave far more evidence. For instance, if your body's been modified by being hit by a ton and a half of that would leave a lot of
I don't think that's... I think that generally speaking, body modification in that form is in no way your choice or anybody.
He was actually a volunteer to be stabbed.
The stabbing part I can understand. The setting on fire part I can understand. The accidentally setting fire is a ritual chamber. Being a firefighter, that sounds like a mistake.
It was a really elaborate ritual. It was in reference to the aliens. They thought they'd build a new one.
Maybe our current theory is that they were trying to placate the gods because there were a lot of earthquakes at that point, and we think that what caused the chamber to catch fire was a giant earthquake that knocked over the
Honestly, we're not stopping. We don't care how... Honestly, we don't even like human sacrifice. We're trying to tell you...
Stop! Damn it!
Does anyone else have any sensible questions, or should we just descend into aliens and smushing?
Sorry about that.
Aliens.
You.
Okay, aliens.
You're not sorry.